Keith.
Good morning, my lady. Today's witness is Matt Hancock.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Mr. Hancock, may I give you the same apology I've given other witnesses we've had to call back? I'm sorry that the modular structure means that we have to keep imposing on you, but thank you for coming.
Not at all.
Could you commence your evidence, please, by giving us your full name?
Yes, I am Matthew John David Hancock.
Mr. Hancock, you are the MP for West Suffolk, and of course, we've received evidence in Module 1 from you that you are Paymaster General and Minister for the Cabinet Office from May 15 to July 16. And then you served as Secretary of State for Health and Social Care from the 9th of July 2018 when you took over from Jeremy Hunt MP, and you served in that post to the 26th of June 2021 when you resigned.
That's right.
Thank you for the provision of a further statement. You obviously provided a great deal of information for the purposes of Module 1, and you gave evidence. And you have further assisted by providing a lengthy statement, 176 pages, which we can see there on the screen, and also a supplementary statement. You were good enough to respond to a number of additional areas that the inquiry put to you. And I just want to put into place, please, some of the building blocks necessary for the questioning that will follow. The inquiry has, I should make plain, received a copy of your book, Pandemic Diaries, which obviously consist of a significant contribution to the debate about the response to coronavirus. Can I just please ask you, though, to make plain that, notwithstanding that it is entitled Pandemic Diaries, it is, to use your words, an account pieced together from formal papers, contemporaneous notes and voice memos, WhatsApps and communications and interviews.
That's right. It's written as contemporaneous rather than with hindsight, but it was written after the pandemic using contemporaneous materials.
Yes. So stylistically, it is not a diary. It is re-pieced together and called a diary.
Correct. It's my recollections.
In the diaries, so-called, and in your statement, you make plain that the remit of the Department of Health and Social Care was a vast one. It had, of course, all its usual business. It was the lead government department in response to this national public health crisis, and the obligations upon it were, to use your words, vast and fast-paced.
Yes.
In Module 1, you accepted in the course of your evidence under oath that there had been a serious and significant inadequacy of preparation within the DHSE for a pandemic health emergency. May the inquiry take from that acceptance that on the cusp of the pandemic in January 2020, the absence of preparation had serious, significant consequences in terms of the DHSE's ability to be able to respond?
Well, of course, as Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, I was responsible not just for the department, but ministerially responsible for the wider health family as well, the agencies, of course, the biggest being the NHS itself, and Public Health England and others. And it is absolutely true, as I set out in my evidence in Module 1, that the plans that we had were not adequate. As we discussed in Module 1, that was, I think, on two bases. The first is in practical terms. For instance, the UK didn't have a significant testing capability, and in terms of the wrong doctrine, which was that all the planning based on the 2011 pandemic flu plan onwards was based on the assumption that we'd be dealing with the consequences of a pandemic rather than trying to suppress a pandemic.
Does it follow from the absence of preparation and perhaps the way in which, in terms of planning, the department, as well as the rest of government, may be said to have been pointing in the wrong direction, that when the DHSE and yourself were required to address the crisis and the breaking of the crisis in January and February, it became apparent that in terms of the structure, the personnel, the resourcing, the money, as well as the absence of plans to deal with the coronavirus, that you were in very real difficulties.
Well, a couple of points on that. The first is I take issue with absence of a plan. There wasn't an absence of a plan. There were plans. I've critiqued the plans. I've said that they weren't adequate, but there were plans in place. There was the 2011 pandemic plan. There'd been the Cygnus exercise under Jeremy Hunt's position as Secretary of State. So there were plans. There were areas in which the early response was very strong. PHE got a diagnostic test together within a matter of days. The early surveillance, essentially led by Professor Van Tam, as he's given evidence, was very good, and our role, the UK's role internationally, strong in the first few weeks. So there were plans, but the plans were inadequate in ways that we discussed in Module 1. With respect directly to the impact of that on the department, of course, when a pandemic strikes, even if you had the very best plans, those responsible for responding would have to strengthen the operation, would have to tool up. And in the early days, we expanded the department very significantly, and we ultimately brought in army personnel, for instance, lots more clinical personnel, others, and we took people off non-pandemic related work and put them onto pandemic related work. All of these things were in response to the pandemic. They would have been needed whether we had, even if we had the perfect plan, even if we learn all the lessons, next time there is a pandemic, and there will be another one, that of course the Department for Health will have to shift to respond to those challenges.
You say there were plans, and you're astute to make the point that there was a plan, the 2011 pandemic flu strategy. But your statement itself says, and I quote it, there was no book or report to pull off a shelf to tell us how to handle a pandemic.
Yes.
So, of course, as with responding to any crisis or emergency faced by government, the absence of a book or report to tell you how to do it is going to have an impact on your practical efficiency, on your ability to respond. That's obvious, isn't it?
Yes. This was the first major pandemic in living memory. There wasn't anybody who'd responded to it. None of my living predecessors as Secretary of State had to deal with something on this scale.
Indeed. You are aware, of course, from the witness statement of Mark Sedwill, now Lord Sedwill, the Cabinet Secretary, that in a report to the Prime Minister in the summer of 2020, he said the DHSC was neither structured nor resourced for a public health crisis of this magnitude. Granted, it's a very broad observation, and it doesn't, of course, deal with the institutional links between the DHSC and the NHS and Public Health England, or the scientific advisory structure, or, of course, the possibility that there would be movements in personnel and a ramping up in funding for the department. But in a broad sense, that is a correct proposition, is it not? Structurally and in terms of resourcing, when the crisis broke, the DHSC was under par.
Well, he didn't use the words under par. They're your words. And I would reject that because the senior personnel in DHSC were absolutely superb and rose to the challenge. But it was blazingly obvious that when a pandemic strikes, the health department is going to have more to do. And so I regard that comment as very straightforward.
All right. Could we have 273901, page 78? This is an extract from Sir Patrick Valence's diaries, dated the 3rd of June 2020, Quad Call exposed the massive internal operational mess inside DHSC and PHE. Could we have page 587? Also, clear lack of grip in DHSC. This is in July. Very good at analysis, no grip on actions, Sedwell. Page 594. Email from within DHSC describes it as ungovernable and a web of competing parts. And I'll summarise, there are other diary entries in Sir Patrick Vallance's evening notes where he says it's clear that once again DHSC has done nothing. People lobbing in points, no clear operational accountability, and so on. Regardless of what reasonable mitigation might be offered, and there is obviously mitigation which may be offered, senior officials in government continue to express concern over a number of months. Lord Sedwell, Sir Patrick Vallance and others, Helen McNamara, about the state of the DHSC. Correct?
Well, I don't know whether these parts of Sir Patrick's diaries were contemporaneous, because I know that some was written after the event.
Well, can I just pause you there with respect? These were evening notes made certainly more contemporaneously than your diary, Pandemic Diaries book. The vast majority were written on the day or the day after. Only some, it is apparent, were written later.
Yeah, so as I say, we don't know whether these are contemporaneous, but that is by the by. The point here, I think, in response, is that when you have an enormous, unprecedented event, the department that is in the forefront of responding to it, of course, is going to do its best to rise to that challenge, and that's what the DHSC did. Did everything go right? Of course it didn't, and you wouldn't expect it to. It is natural for the centre, the Cabinet Office, to be sceptical of departments. That's what I was the Cabinet Office Minister, as you've noted. The culture of the Cabinet Office is to be sceptical of the operation of departments, partly to hold them to account. I think that the toxic culture that you've seen at the centre of government, that's been subject of much discussion, was unhelpful in assuming that when anything was difficult or a challenge, therefore there was somehow fault and blame. That is a part of the toxic culture that we've seen, and some of these exhibits that you've just shown demonstrate a lack of generosity or empathy in understanding the difficulty of rising to such a big challenge. So, did the DHSC need to expand and grow? Of course. Did it get everything right? No, of course not. There were, no doubt, we'll go into individual challenges. But did it rise to the challenge overall of responding to the biggest public health crisis in a century? I think it did. If you look at the successes, for instance, on the growth of testing once the department took that over, getting the vaccine rollout up and running, various other projects. So, you know, we can go through all of the detail. In terms of lessons learned, what is crucial is that any department in future is ready to go. And I'll make one final point, if I may, which is relevant to your question. At the start of the pandemic, the department, including me, was trying to wake up Whitehall to this threat. And early on, the department ended up doing things which really aren't for a health department. But we were doing them because nobody else was.
Could you just give us
I'll give you one example. Shielding the Vulnerable is a programme that eventually was run very, very well by Chris Townsend, who was brought in from outside, and MHCLG departmentally. It was about how to get groceries to people, how to make sure that people got support, including from volunteers, how to make sure we looked after those who were the most vulnerable. that is clearly a cross-government effort and rightly led from a department that isn't the health department. But it was, I had to commission the work to get that going from the health department. Similarly, the view over whether or not to close schools ended up, and the NPIs ended up within the health department early on. Now that was taken back to the CTF, back into the Cabinet Office, and rightly so. So the department, yes, had a huge amount to do, but I would argue that because the rest of Whitehall was slow getting going, we had to get up there and do it. And if that led to criticisms from those in the centre of government, then, frankly, I'd far rather that we did step up and take that responsibility, even though it brought us flack later and evidently flack at the time that I wasn't aware of, because these issues were never raised with me personally.
Scepticism, is that a reference to, and you know very well that we're coming to this a little later, the notion that individuals in central government were critical of your department because they had taken again you, they were tarring your department with the same brush as they were you, that there was a campaign, if you like, of spite and aggression against you and your department. Is that what you're suggesting by the notion that there was scepticism towards the DHSE?
Well, there is healthy scepticism of the centre of government of departments in which they challenge, hold to account, and generally try to keep departments moving forward. Now, I, as a Cabinet Office Minister, one of my roles was to make sure departments were delivering on what they'd said that they would deliver. We have seen from the emails that I wasn't, and the messages I wasn't aware of at the time, that clearly flipped over into an unhealthy, toxic culture at the centre, where anything that went wrong was seen as a almost intentional failure. And worse, that amongst some people, misinformation about what the department was delivering was spread, including to the Prime Minister and at the very highest levels. So a healthy culture involves challenge and scepticism. An unhealthy, toxic culture involves a failure properly to engage and instead throwing of false allegations and extremely unpleasant language. What you'll notice when you go through all of the documents is you just didn't have that within the health family. I tried to lead a positive culture, a can-do culture, where if there was a problem, the question that was raised in the department was, how do we fix this? Now, that didn't happen all of the time. Of course, there were moments of frustration, but that was my overall attitude in this areas I led. And you can see, unfortunately, that we rubbed up against this deep unpleasantness at the centre.
If I may say so, you're doing extremely well, Mr. Hancock, in terms of the speed of your response. Could you, however, try to be a little bit more concise in your answers?
I will.
I asked you deliberately to give the inquiry some examples of where you feel that the DHSC had excelled. And you've referred to testing, and you've referred to the vaccination programme, and also to shielding. The testing, it is self-evident, was a process that was underway, and a great deal of time and energy was devoted to it throughout 2020, but it really only reached its fruition later in the year.
Yeah.
Vaccination, obviously, was a matter only from 2021, largely, and shielding was...
No, the work on vaccination started in January 2020. And DHSC, of course, didn't...
Mr. Hancock, will you please wait for the question? The vaccination programme was rolled out, of course, in 2021, and it's obvious that work was done on commissioning it and funding it and so on in advance. That's self-evident. But the shielding programme was a cross-government exercise led both by the DHSC and the General Public Services Ministerial Implementation Group, latterly. But in the early part of the year, so we're focusing, of course, in this module, particularly on January, February, March, April, evidence has been given that the DHSC focus too much on itself and on the acute health system, NHS, as opposed to the wider long-term health of the public. By that, I mean a reference to, and the witness meant a reference to, health control, to infection control, to the core issue in the first part of the year of dealing with the spread of the virus. Do you think that the DHSC on this crucial issue of infection control, of dealing with that part of the public health crisis, was up to the mark?
Yes.
Now, in Sir Patrick Vallance's records and in the evidence of Helen McNamara, there are repeated references to how in February and March you were, quote, desperate to own and lead, that you kept too much in the DHSC, that you were reluctant to explain that there was a risk of the NHS becoming overwhelmed, and you were bad at asking the Cabinet Office for help. You were aware of the material. Does that not all rather suggest that in those vital days of January through to March, the DHSC failed to tell central government how bad it was and what could be done to address the question of infection control?
No, that's completely the wrong way round. From the middle of January, we were trying to effectively raise the alarm. We were trying to wake up Whitehall to the scale of the problem. And this was a problem that couldn't be addressed only from the health department. Non-pharmaceutical interventions cannot be put in place by a health department. A health department can't shut schools. It should have been grasped and led from the centre of government earlier. And you've seen evidence that repeatedly the department, across the department, and I tried to make this happen. And we were on occasions blocked, and at other times, I would say our concerns were not taken as seriously as they should have been until the very end of February. So, for instance, the very first time I tried to call a COBRA, I was blocked, ultimately only for 48 hours, because I then went to get other voices to call for a COBRA, and it happened. And getting the machine at the centre of government up and running was incredibly hard and took a huge amount of effort. When it did finally get up and running at the end of February, then things started to move. And so I've heard these accusations that we tried to do too much. On the contrary, there was so much that needed to be done, and in some cases we just had to get on and do it. It would have been far better if, instead of thinking that we were overreacting, as the COBRA machine clearly thought we were, if they had embraced the challenges and it had been led from the centre. If I think had there been under another regime, under another cabinet secretary, I was a minister under David Cameron, under Theresa May. The centre would have chaired those early COBRAs. Yes, of course, I, as Secretary of State, would have played a big part, but it would have been a cross-government effort. And in future, that's what it should be. The lead government department model works very well for small crises, for medium-sized crises, but it does not work for a crisis that is a whole of government, indeed a whole of society crisis.
We'll come back to COBRA, and you're aware, of course, that I'll be asking you about particular COBRA meetings. You've given an example there of COBRA, and you've put it in the context of the difficulties in getting the government machine going until the end of February.
Yes, at the centre. The department was working full-time on this from middle of January.
If it was hard to get the government machine going, and you've referred to the effort required and the difficulties that you encountered, may we take it from that the system took time to be geared up at the centre of government?
Yes.
Presumably, there was an avoidable delay, therefore, baked into this governmental system. If it took time to get it going, to react appropriately and sufficiently, then time would have been lost.
Well, to be fair, the early actions that were needed were essentially health department and the health family actions, developing the early test, making sure that we supported the universities who were developing the vaccines, the very early contact tracing, the responses to the individual cases. The first cases didn't come to the UK until the very end of January, start of February. And so the early actions were for the department. So I thought it was reasonable, for instance, the very first COBRA, that I should chair it. But there was a point when we needed to go broader than things that ought to be the remit of the department. My argument, my point, in response to these allegations that we held too much within the department or that we didn't get on with stuff, is somebody's accused the department of being overwhelmed. Well, we were certainly whelmed. We were certainly very, very busy, and we were having to do things that in future ought to be done by other departments or at the centre, because it should have been a whole government response earlier. That's my reflection.
And what about after the end of February? So March and April,
Yeah.
as the cross-government machine ramps up,
Yeah.
as the scale of the crisis is finally understood and steps had to be taken, to what extent had the DHSE got on top of coordinating or promoting or suggesting the sorts of countermeasures and infection control measures that ultimately were at the heart of the government's response?
Well, so from the end of February, when the Prime Minister took the chair at COBRA, which was symbolically very important, when the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster got stuck in, and you heard from him how he came to a COBRA, was alarmed, asked some very good questions, followed that up with me, and you might think that I was unhappy to receive that email and those questions. On the contrary, I was delighted, and after a discussion about where we were up to, he became a very, very strong ally in driving action all the way through the crisis. So from early March, it shifted and it became a whole government effort. Of course, in March, April, the department continued to have to do much, much, much more and increasing amounts. And so we were under enormous pressure and enormous stress. We brought in more resources, basically from wherever we could find them, and did everything that we could. But it was that ramp up was extremely difficult.
Mr. Hancock, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could I just ask you to rewind? I didn't realise Mr. Keith was moving on. Going back to the time before the end of February, and appreciate you say that central government should have got involved earlier. Apart from the fact that other government departments would have done some of the work that you felt that your department had to, was anything not done? I appreciate you shouldn't have been doing it, you say, but was anything not done because central government wasn't involved earlier?
Well, I think that for the future, the plans for what NPIs to put in place, for instance, that isn't a health department thing. And once we got the structures properly set up, it wasn't a health department thing. It was a cabinet office thing, quite rightly. So it was in mid to late February that the SAGE system got going on designing NPIs, and we also did some work on that in the department, especially in the area of the legals that were needed. That sort of work, hopefully for next time, will already be on the books. We should already have published legal draft legislation, published draft legislation that is ready in case it needs to be enacted. Back then, we thankfully, thanks to the preparation work, one of the areas of preparation work that went well, we had a draft bill. In future, that already should be published and scrutinised. So there's two examples: the legals and the NPI.
May we presume that, and you've just said it was an incredibly difficult task faced by the DHSE.
Yeah.
But by the beginning of March, as you were grappling with the emerging scientific advice as to the state of the transmission of the outbreak, how far it had got, to what extent it had become sustained within the community in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Dealing with the absence of plans and, as you say in your book, having to formulate a battle plan, having to consider for the first time in 100 years some of these extraordinarily stringent countermeasures. The DHSC must have been under very considerable stress. I mean, this was not an obligation that you sought. You were a lead government department responding to a whole government crisis, a whole nation crisis.
Yes.
Was the DHSC under stress? Was it in difficulties at the beginning of March?
We were under enormous stress. We were working incredibly hard, yes.
Could we have 129226, please, which is a text from yourself to Boris Johnson on the 7th of March, page 2. He asks you, anything I can do to help? You're doing great, keep going. And you say, kind of you to say, it's not easy. You're doing great too, follow the science. And you ask for help in relation to, or you invite him to start thinking about how he could contribute to a call for a public effort, a clarion call for hand washing and helping old folks if they have to stay home. It's a great unifying clarion call for you to lead when the time is right. Was that not an opportunity for you to say to the Prime Minister, well, we absolutely have to get on top of the very real difficulties with the absence of real plans for infection control, with the development and implementation of countermeasures, with the incredibly difficult issue of funding and planning for vaccines, shielding, all the other areas that your department was grappling with?
By this point, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet Office machine, and Number 10 were wholly engaged. The Prime Minister, I think, chaired the first COBRA on the 2nd of March. And so we'd had almost a week of me being able to say all of that. So I think this was he asked if I could anything I could do to help, and I said we should have a whole national effort. So that pretty much covers all bases.
And Mr. Hancock, you're aware that the very senior civil servant, Helen McNamara, who was at one stage Deputy Cabinet Secretary, described you in evidence as having nuclear levels of confidence, which she thought was a problem. Do you reject the notion that in your dealings with your colleagues, in terms of the impression that you gave, you were overconfident in presenting the undoubtedly extraordinarily difficult issues that your department faced?
It depends who with. I had enormous doubts at this point. I would ask people I trusted for advice. I had long discussions with, for instance, Chris Wormold, Chris Whitty, about how we were responding. We were in a trusted environment. We were self-critical about how we were responding. That's only natural because we could see what was happening, and we could see that we were in the middle of something that hadn't happened for decades, and it was on our watch, so to speak. It's also, I also thought it was necessary, and I can understand how some people will have interpreted the way that I now know that they did, although I didn't know this at the time because nobody raised any of these issues with me at the time. I can see how, my sense of needing to keep driving the system forward might have had this impact on some people, who, especially those who were more sceptical of the need of the government to act, frankly. We have seen some of the evidence that the same people who were accusing me of overconfidence at the same time were blocking the action that I was saying we needed. And so I can now see the dynamics of if they were against action being taken, and I was going in and saying we absolutely must do this, and there was a huge amount of uncertainty and a huge amount of worry, and I basically felt it was my professional duty to try to keep going, to keep driving forward.
Who was against action being taken?
Well, I don't want to point fingers because everybody was doing their best.
Which government department significantly was against action being taken?
Well, for instance, the reluctance to get the Cobra machine going. We've seen some of the evidence of certain individuals thinking that we were overreacting or the world had gone mad. There was a delay, an inexplicable delay at the centre to the publication of the action plan, which came on the 3rd, and we've seen some evidence of why that happened. So there's various examples of it, but I basically felt that I had to drive this thing forward, and I felt that sense of responsibility. Of course, and of course, I understand that now that some people, reacted in the way that they did, but it was a time of enormous uncertainty and a time when I just felt we needed to keep driving this system forward.
We will look at some of the areas, and indeed, in fact, all the areas that you've identified, Mr. Hancock, where there may have been evidence of the government machine being delayed or of action not being taken when it could reasonably have been taken. May the inquiry presume and conclude from what you've said about the difficulties in getting the government machine going, that there were these instances of people pushing back or not doing perhaps what they should have done, that by and large there was overall, therefore, an avoidable delay.
Well,
between the beginning of February, and we'll look now at the material that was available to you and to the machine, and the lockdown decision of the 23rd of March. It just didn't have to have been that long.
Can I answer that question contemporaneously and then with hindsight? Contemporaneously, people were doing their jobs to the best of their ability. The Cabinet Secretary had a reason for not wanting to call a Cobra unnecessarily, and it took 48 hours to persuade him, and that was because he thought they were overused previously. He was worried that it was for use for communications purposes. I did not want it for communications purposes. I wanted it for substantive reasons to get the government machine moving. People had good reasons at the time, and maybe because they weren't faced like I was with the daily evidence of this growing crisis. They simply didn't cotton on to the fact that this enormous wave was coming. So I don't think it's fair to criticise people for making professional judgments at the time. With hindsight, knowing what we know now, it's obvious to everybody that there should have been a whole of government response from earlier, but you've got to remember the fog of uncertainty and the lack of data. And there weren't cases in the UK till the end of January. The first death in the UK, very sadly, in the UK was on the 1st of March. So this was very, very early on.
You have described, Mr. Hancock, how you saw the government machine trying to ramp itself up. You could see the difficulties that on your evidence, the department and yourself encountered. You've given evidence about the instances in which people push back or where there may have been a failure to act reasonably speedily. So you must have been aware, you were the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, that things were not being progressed as you, in your own words, would have wished. So you must have been aware of the delay.
Yes.
The inquiry has no interest in you trying to, and rightly so, not identify individuals to blame. But you must have been aware that cross-government, systemically, the United Kingdom government was failing to respond sufficiently, speedily and well in this crisis. It's not a matter of hindsight. You could see it happening at the time.
Well, I found frustrations in areas I wanted to push forward at the time. The evidence I'm giving is that now, having seen it from the inside, in many cases, people had reasonable arguments for why they were doing that. They were behaving professionally. There was, of course, also this very unpleasant, toxic culture. But I think that became a problem later rather than early on. I think it was just reasonable people doing their jobs, saying, really? There are known costs to the things that I was trying to do and unknown benefits, because at this point it might still have all been contained within China. So people saying, are you sure you want to do this? Do we really want to tell the public we might shut down whole cities? Well, yes, I did want to do that. But I can I'm just trying to empathise with why people reacted the way that they did at the time.
Now, you've mentioned plans, and the lack of planning is an important part of the inquiry's examination of this area. In your statement, and you've acknowledged it already, you observe that there was no book or report to pull off a shelf to tell us how to handle a pandemic. But in a WhatsApp message from you to Mr. Cummings on the 12th of March, could we have 48313, page 68? In the context, Mr. Hancock, to put this in its correct context, watching Question Time, we need to up gear on winning the public argument. So it's in the context of the debate that was then rumbling on, in fact, about reasonable worst-case scenario, herd immunity, behavioural fatigue, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
You say we are better prepared than other countries. By the 12th of March, you were surely aware that we were not better prepared than other countries. There was, and you've acknowledged it already, a complete understanding that there was no scaled-up test, trace, isolate, contact isolate system beyond the first few hundred cases. There was no effective means of infection control. There was no border plans or quarantine system in place. You knew there was sustained community transmission in the United Kingdom by this date, and you knew that the infection fatality rate was 1%. 1% of all infected people would die. Why did you say we are better prepared than other countries?
Well, I think there's two ways to answer that question. The first is this is about a communications question, and the 12th of March was the end of the period in which we were concerned about the timing of lockdown and making sure that we didn't go too early. And I changed my view on that on the 13th.
Can I which be polite, just interrupt you there to say, is that a reference to the debate which rumbled on, in fact, for quite some time, about the risk of going too early in terms of any countermeasures that might be implied?
Yes, and for instance, I look back on the interview I gave on Sunday morning of the 1st of March, when I said, of course, there's a risk of going too early, and the interviewer said, yes, well, of course, we all understand that. So this was a widely shared belief that, in hindsight, was wrong, because our doctrine was wrong, as we discussed in the first module. And so this is a comms recommendation to the guy responsible for comms in number 10. As it happened, what I think this actually shows is the end of the road for this argument. This argument that we didn't need to move, we should wait, it was better to wait. This argument came to its end essentially at this point.
The point about it being a communications debate is well made. You're obviously being asked in the context of watching Question Time.
Yeah.
But your evidence so far, Mr. Hancock, has been very much the effect of the DHSC was a siren voice calling for more to be done, for trying to push the government machine on. But by the 12th of March, as you knew very well, the United Kingdom government had reached the end, even by that late stage, of the containment phase of the strategy. The virus was rife. Should you not have been taking this opportunity to tell your colleagues in government, telling the public, telling the citizens of this nation, this wall of death is coming, and we have no effective means to deal with it other than to impose infection control measures urgently and significantly.
Well, in my public communications, you will know that I had at that point been explaining that we might have to do that, yes. But I'm also a team player, and the government position was not yet. So this was a message about how to best explain the government position of not yet. But as I say, the position of not yet was running to the end of its road, and it was on the very next day that I first told the Prime Minister that I thought that we needed to lock down.
Was that the 13th of March?
Correct.
It's not in your diary, so-called, I should say, Mr. Hancock. The entry for the 13th of March makes no reference to you telling the Prime Minister this vital piece of information that he should lock down immediately. There is a whole page on how you woke up for the dawn flight to Belfast and Edinburgh Airport.
Yeah.
There was, from the Prime Ministerial meeting, Prime Ministerial papers, a video call, 9:30 that morning, and according to your book, you say, I called the Prime Minister and told him we'd have to do some very rapid backpedalling on the issue of herd immunity.
Yeah.
Then rang Patrick, who promised to do his best to repair the damage.
Yeah.
You then met with First Minister in Belfast. You then went to Cardiff, and so on.
Yes.
Telling the Prime Minister of this country for the first time that he had to call an immediate lockdown is surely worthy of some recollection, is it not?
I didn't have full access to my papers for writing of that, and this came to light in researching the papers ahead of this inquiry. This is, after all, the formal public inquiry. What then happened is that was on the 13th, which was the Friday. On the 14th, we then had formal meetings in the cabinet room on this subject, and I again made my views very clear. But this shift from we should wait because we've got to get the timing right to we must act now happened quickly. So, for instance, on the 13th of March, there was a G7 call with my, and I was very struck, especially by my Italian opposite number, because they had put in place the lockdown across the whole of Italy by then, and he was describing where they were up to, and it was harrowing.
Forgive me. Your book says the account that follows has been meticulously pieced together from my formal papers, notes, voice memos, my communications, WhatsApps, we know from the press, and it records in 555 pages all the relevant, important events as you saw it concerning the coronavirus response. But there is no reference to you telling the Prime Minister to call for an immediate lockdown on the 13th of March. And you know that there are no notes and no emails in the inquiry's possession, because we've given them to you, that records that conversation. So I am required to ask you, how sure are you that you told the Prime Minister that he had to call for an immediate lockdown in a call on the 13th of March?
I can remember it, and it came to light in looking forward to this inquiry. And what's more, the corroborating evidence, if you like, is that it is recorded that on the 14th, which was the Saturday, there was significant discussions in number 10, at which I made this case again.
All right. Could we have 48313, page 5, please, on the screen? This is a WhatsApp message between you and Mr. Cummings a bit earlier, Mr. Hancock, on the 23rd of January. Evidence has been given to this inquiry by Mr. Cummings that he WhatsApped you, as we can see there, to ask you to what extent have you investigated preparations for something terrible like Ebola or a flu pandemic. yes, you say, we have full plans, plural, up to and including pandemic levels, regularly prepped and refreshed.
Yeah.
So just pausing there, that may give the impression that whatever plans they were, and however deficient or effective they had been recently, because of the word refreshed, prepped and brought up to date.
Yeah.
Very fairly, you accept in your book and in your statement that the only plan that there was a strategy plan from 2011 in the field of central government response to a pandemic, not NHS surge capacity or beds, but the central government response to a pandemic. There was the 2011 strategy.
Yeah.
A single document based doctrinally on a completely inappropriate approach.
Yeah. This is what I thought at the time, as you can see.
But who told you that?
Public Health England, the World Health Organization.
Well, just pause there. The World Health Organization doesn't, of course, hold the book for the United Kingdom plans.
No, but it did analysis on which countries are the best prepared, and we were the second overall. So all I can tell you is what I thought at the time. It's not what I think now. You wouldn't, as the Secretary of State, phoned up the World Health Organization and said, what are our plans? You would have made inquiries in your department. Yes.
When you made those inquiries, what plans are there?
Yes.
What information, what description of those plans were you given?
Well, it was essentially the output of the Cygnus exercise, the fact that we had legislative plans available if necessary. We had both the legislative vehicle of the 1984 Public Health Act, and we had the draft bill, which by then I will have known about. We had plans to get testing up and running within PHE. Now, that obviously happened far too slowly thereafter. But remember, at this point, PHE had performed extremely well in the early couple of weeks of the pandemic by developing a test within 3 days of receiving the data from China. We had, by then, in the department already discussed the vaccine, and we knew that we had a vaccine platform that had been funded in order to respond to Ebola that had the potential to be used in response to this new virus at Oxford University. With hindsight, it would have been far better if I'd said, I do know about this, I really need your help. The plans that we've got aren't up to it. But that wasn't what I thought, what I was being told at the time.
You're the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care.
Yeah.
The country is facing an unknown but extremely serious pathogenic outbreak on the 23rd of January. Nobody knows how far it's going to spread at that stage, but you plainly need to know what the plans are. My question was put to you to elicit what your understanding was from your staff and your advisors and your officials of the government's central infection control plans.
Yes.
Prosaically, do we shut schools?
Yes.
Do we quarantine people? Do we have hand washing? Do we self-isolate? If so, for how long, and whether is it individually or is it for a household? Those sorts of issues. So not pandemic bill proposals.
Why not?
Well,
it's important as well.
Mr. Hancock, because that is not the question I've asked you. I want to know about what your understanding was of the state of play of the countermeasures. That's to say, the infection control measures, not vaccine proposals or Cygnus reports, which didn't deal, of course, with countermeasures, or legislative proposals, but prosaically, how, as a country, are we going to stop the virus from spreading if it comes?
There's a number of things in your question I need to correct. Cygnus was involved with legislative proposals.
I suggested it wasn't involved with proposals for countermeasures. It didn't propose particular countermeasures in its recommendations.
The Cygnus was, contrary to your initial question, involved in legislative proposals. Furthermore, legislative proposals are countermeasures because you can't isolate people against their will without legislation. So this attempt in the questioning to split off different parts of the overall response is false. That's why I'm responding in the way that I am to your question. The premise of the question was wrong. The reason that I held this confident view at that point is because, for instance, the Global Health Security Index in 2019 said that we were the second best country prepared in the world after the US, and that we were the best in the world in the subcategory of rapid response to and mitigation of the spread of an epidemic. The WHO said the UK remains amongst the leaders worldwide in preparing for a pandemic. This all turned out not to be true, but it is what I was being told at the time.
All right. On the 6th of February 2020, there was a cabinet meeting, Mr. Hancock. 56137, page 6. Concluding, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care said he was grateful for the support of his ministerial colleagues. There were 2 cases in the United Kingdom. They were, of course, as you've correctly identified, on the 30th and 31st of January. And there would almost certainly be more. The approach to tackling the virus in the United Kingdom to date had been medic-led. The central point, according to these minutes, Mr. Hancock, that you then make is that the government had a plan to deal with this illness.
Yes.
You didn't, in fact, within the Department of Health and Social Care, commission until the 10th of February the plan, the battle plan as you describe it in your statement, or the action plan as it was published on the 3rd of March. And therefore, what plan was it that you were referring your cabinet colleagues to deal with the illness?
Well, firstly, we had the pandemic flu strategy set out in 2011. But by this point, we had a whole series of different plans for expanding different areas. So we had a plan for the expansion of testing within PHE. Now, that plan did not go fast enough, and I had to take serious action to change that in the middle of March. We had a plan for the development of a vaccine, and we'd already put extra funds into the development of a vaccine by this point. We had a whole series of plans. In a number of questions, you've said there was an absence of a plan. That is not true. There was a plan. In fact, there was a plan with detail on a whole different series of areas. My critique of the plan is that it was not an adequate plan in doctrine or in level of detail, and it's absolutely incumbent on this inquiry to get to the substance of what the future plan should be, and it's that substance that really matters. So we had a plan. It was guided by the science. By this point, I was much more worried that on the 23rd of January, and really it was over the last week of January that my worry levels changed categorically because we saw the reasonable worst case scenario, and I remember that meeting very vividly. That was at the end of January. You'll also notice in here that I said in the reasonable worst case scenario we'd see almost every government department affected. Well, that was an understatement. I shouldn't have said almost. And that colleagues should attend personally or designate a junior minister who was dedicated to this task. Dedicated. So this is clearly me saying to the rest of my cabinet colleagues, we're all going to have to get stuck in on this. And yes, we did have a plan. It is entirely reasonable for me to both explain that we had a plan, indeed plans in place, but also critique for the future where those plans were flawed.
One further question on this topic, please, Mr. Hancock. On the 14th of February 2020, so a week or so later, we needn't put the document up, but at page 7 of the Cabinet minutes, or the note of the meeting, again, your Cabinet colleagues are told the government had a plan informed by science.
Yes.
Helen McNamara has given evidence to the effect through her witness statement that time and time again, Cabinet was assured that, quote, we had plans in place. You have described the vaccine preparation work. what was done, and we'll come to the detail of it in due course, what was done by way of testing. But so that we can clearly understand your response, are you saying that there was, throughout February, already in place a plan for countermeasures, that is to say, infection control measures, the sorts of measures which were ultimately put into place on the 12th of March, the 16th of March, the 20th of March, and the 23rd of March?
I'm so sorry. We didn't put measures into place on the 12th of March.
12th of March was the first day on which measures were put into place. You'll recall it was the order for symptomatic individuals to isolate for 7 days.
The measures that were put in place were much more stringent than had been envisaged in the original plan.
Could you please just answer the question? Were there, as far as you understood it, on the advice of your advisors and your colleagues, plans for countermeasures, for infection control measures in existence and informed to the Cabinet in February 2020?
There was a plan as set out and based on the 2011 pandemic flu plan, updated with the conclusions of Cygnus. And in Module 1, we discussed at length the flaws in that plan. The argument there wasn't a plan is false. Indeed, I've heard a number of Cabinet Office figures argue that there wasn't a plan. If you look at the 28th of February submission to the Prime Minister by CCS, it sets out that we have very advanced plans. In fact, it is much too bullish and self-confident, that note. And the idea that it was wrong to suggest that we had a plan is completely false. I appreciate that some people in the Cabinet Office did then later catch up with the seriousness of the situation and become rather alarmed. I think that their reaction when they finally woke up, in some cases, was helpful because the machine ground into action. In some cases, it was not particularly helpful because it would have been better if they'd said, we now realise there's a problem, what have you been doing about it, as opposed to the toxic blame culture that we've seen and referred to already.
Milady, I'm coming to a completely different subject. Would you like to have a break then, or would you like me to trundle on?
No. I shall return at 20 past. Mr. Keith.
Mr. Hancock, the different issue, the new issue, is asymptomatic transmission.
Is it possible to add one small coda to an answer which I gave just before?
By all means.
Because you were questioning me about my call to the Prime Minister on the 13th of March and the fact that this wasn't in my book. Since I wrote that book, further evidence has come to light because I've been preparing for the inquiry. And if you look at INQ 000226628, you will, for instance, see an email from me to the Prime Minister on the 13th of March arguing for a suppression strategy and indeed making the case that we should make the argument globally for a suppression strategy because of the international exposure of the UK. So there is hard evidence that came to light since I wrote the book, which explains why I've been able to expand further on this period in my testimony.
Mr. Hancock, the inquiry is well aware of that email. There is an email to the Prime Minister, and there are a series of WhatsApps on the 13th and 14th of March in which you attempt to corral support for a global strategy of eradicating the virus.
Yes.
In that email on the 13th of March, to which you wish us to have regard, do you use the word immediate or lockdown?
I don't have it in front of me.
Do you use the word immediate or lockdown?
I don't have it in front of me.
All right. Asymptomatic transmission. The great importance of asymptomatic transmission is that until you know whether or not transmission is asymptomatic, you cannot work out from the number of people who are hospitalized and from the number of those persons who are hospitalized who may die, what the full extent of the viral spread is. Because if you're asymptomatic, you may transmit the virus without showing symptoms, and therefore it's impossible to know, unless you mass test the whole population, who has got the virus. So you can't work out what proportion will be hospitalized, what proportion will die. You can't see the scale of the problem. And in your witness statement, you say, my single greatest regret is not pushing harder for asymptomatic transmission to be the baseline assumption. You say global scientific consensus reflected in the global scientific advice from the World Health Organization until April 2020 was that there was no asymptomatic transmission. That's what you say in your statement, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. In your diaries, and we'll just very quickly, in your book, page 2, you say, and it's quite difficult to see the...
Page 22, I think.
No, it's page 2 of our document, Mr. Hancock.
Oh, I see.
We've transcribed the relevant extracts into a separate document. PHE is adamant that a coronavirus can't be passed on and the tests don't work on people without symptoms. On pages 2 to 3 of this document, the 27th of January, I pushed him, that's Professor Sir Chris Whitty, on my worries about asymptomatic transmission. He said that the global scientific consensus is still that this is unlikely, but is unlikely enough. If you can get it, pass it on and show no symptoms, it will be impossible to manage.
Yes.
And on the 29th of January, page 4 of our document, you say, feeling like a broken record, you push PHE about asymptomatic transmission.
Yes.
And it is correct to say that in your book for the 3rd of April, you note the publication by the World Health Organization of a report dated the 2nd of April, in which there is reference to evidence of documented asymptomatic transmission.
Isn't that a CDC note, not a WHO note?
Yes, in fact, there are both. But yes, your book may refer to the CDC, but the World Health Organization restated the position 2 days before on the 2nd of April, or a day before. So your regret appears to be that you were told, and certainly did not understand, but because you weren't told, that there was likely to be, or there may have been, asymptomatic transmission at an early enough stage when it really, really mattered. Is that the number?
Yes.
All right. There was a meeting on the 27th of January.
Yep.
106067, page 1. Where the chief medical officer says, the CMO commented that previously our best understanding was that the virus was unlikely to transmit whilst patients were asymptomatic, but this is unable to be definitive. There is still a lack of clarity over what the Chinese official position is. CMO would expect that very symptomatic persons would be more likely to transmit the virus, and then CMO was confident but could not guarantee that asymptomatic persons would be less contagious than heavily symptomatic persons. If you could just hold that paragraph in your mind, Mr. Hancock, and we'll look at a meeting the next day, the 28th of January, 233747, page 2. Second bullet point. CMO commented that today's data appears slightly less reassuring than yesterday's, but the positive is that there has been no sustained transmission out of China. CMO commented that we cannot fully understand whether the measures imposed by China have had any significant impact in delaying transmission. And I think if we scroll back out, there is then a reference to Germany. In this long page, I'm unlikely to be able to find it.
CMO commented that there's now credible evidence of asymptomatic transmission within Germany.
Thank you very much. It's about a third to half the way down the page. If we could just scroll in on that. CMO commented there's now credible evidence of asymptomatic transmission within Germany. PHE reiterated there is no test for asymptomatic patients, and this would not be possible without invasive tests. And I apologise again to you, Mr. Hancock, if you could just bear that document in mind. And then we'll look at a SAGE meeting of the 4th of February, 51925, page 3, paragraph 19. Asymptomatic transmission cannot be ruled out, and transmission from mildly symptomatic individuals is likely. And I'm going to summarise the remainder of the material bar 1. There's a nerve tag meeting on the 21st of February, 119469, page 6. Page 6, paragraph 3.4. The evidence suggests Professor John Edmonds commented on this after the meeting, taking into account the issue of asymptomatic cases, where the evidence suggests that 40% of virologically confirmed cases are asymptomatic. And that is, of course, in the context of the virus at large, but in particular, its spread in Singapore, South Korea, and Japan. So that material, together, Mr. Hancock, with another SAGE meeting in the 4th of February, tends to suggest that what the issue was whether or not there was a significant level of transmissibility in persons who were asymptomatic, that is to say, showing no symptoms. Putting it another way, if they're not symptomatic, they're not showing symptoms, then their transmissibility, the degree of contagion or contagiousness, is likely to be lower. This material doesn't say in terms there is no asymptomatic transmission. It simply says it reflects the developing learning. It's not likely, but it becomes increasingly likely, and indeed by the nerve tag meeting the 21st of February, there was clear material to suggest there is asymptomatic transmission.
Yes.
In relation to the virus and its application abroad. So what were you told about that degree of difference? Were you told there is no asymptomatic transmission, which is what you appear to have been told?
Yeah.
Or were you told it's very difficult to be sure, there are no certainties in this sphere, but it's possible and then likely to be asymptomatic transmission? And of course, ultimately, as you know very well, a precautionary approach is applied. We can't take the risk that there isn't. We better work on the premise that there is.
Yes. So this was...
I apologise for very...
No, it's an incredibly important subject. This was a deep frustration to me at the time, and it is, as I said, my single greatest regret with hindsight was not pushing on this harder. And ultimately not overruling the formal scientific advice that I was receiving. So there's only one thing in your summary that I would challenge, which is that the WHO statement of the 2nd of April that you referred to, in fact said, and I quote, no documented asymptomatic transmission. It was then on the 3rd of April that the CDC came forward with a survey which demonstrated to a point of scientific clarity that there was highly likely to be asymptomatic transmission. And it was that CDC document, and I remember it very clearly at the time, that was instrumental in then changing the scientific evidence that underpinned the policy advice in the UK. So I was aware from very early on of the concerns that there may be asymptomatic transmission. As you've noted, I raised the question on the 27th of January. I also discussed the question with Jens Spahn, my opposite number in Germany, to whom I was close. I asked the Director General of the WHO about the evidence from China, and he described the Chinese reports, which I'd seen in newspapers, but also came formally through a diptel, although I don't recall seeing the diptel at the time. He described those as a translation error, and I was within the UK system, they were also described to me as a translation error. So I was aware of this from January. I understood the implications of significant asymptomatic transmission, and my recollection is I kept on pushing on this question in January and February especially. It became the settled international view that policy should be based on an assumption of the transmission mechanism of SARS-CoV-1, i.e. SARS, as it's commonly known, because there was not scientifically robust information to contradict that. And here is an example of where the scientific method, which I enormously respect, comes into challenge in a period of enormous change and uncertainty. Because the scientists, to be able to base policy on a different assumption, wanted concrete, scientifically credible evidence. And what I had was essentially anecdotal evidence. And it was only when the CDC had performed this formal study, which they published on the 3rd of April, that the scientific establishment switched position. It's understandable the scientists base their advice on the scientific method, and so it is a problem, because there are other examples, without wishing to go on too long, there are other examples, like in the discovery of treatments and the ruling out of treatments like hydroxychloroquine, where some countries moved policy ahead of a formal scientific conclusion and got it wrong, because the science actually, if you waited for the scientific method to be applied, you got, in that case, the answer that hydroxychloroquine didn't make a difference. So the scientific method matters, but it delayed the formal scientific advice telling us that we should base policy on an assumption that there can be asymptomatic transmission. I'm sorry that's a long answer, but it's a very, very important subject.
Indeed. My question was framed exclusively about your understanding.
Yes.
In your book, you repeatedly state you were told that the coronavirus can't be passed on by somebody without symptoms.
Yes. And that the previous 6 coronaviruses known to infect humans did not transmit asymptomatically. In
evidence today, you have acknowledged that there were concerns that there may be asymptomatic transmission.
Yes. I had them.
And if you just allow me.
Sorry.
And in your statement, you say it's your single greatest regret that you didn't push harder back against the notion, by implication, that you were told there was no asymptomatic transmission.
Yes.
The two cannot live together. Either you were told and you didn't understand, to the contrary, you were told there is no asymptomatic transmission, or you were told of concerns that there may be asymptomatic transmission, and those concerns crystallized over time. Which is it?
I have explained, and I'll try to do a better job of explaining.
Well, no, no, Mr. Hancock, please, if you would bear with us. Which of those is the correct position? What was your understanding? It's one or the other?
No, it isn't one or the other. That's what I was going to explain. Okay? I will give you my evidence of what I knew at the time and felt at the time and understood at the time. In late January, I became aware of concerns that there may have been asymptomatic transmission from China, from Germany. I challenged the system on whether there was or not. What came back was that, yes, there was anecdotal evidence that there may have been asymptomatic transmission, but that we should not base policy on that assumption. Instead, the reasonable this is what was said to me, the reasonable assumption should be made that COVID transmits as SARS did. And if you read, for instance, the 2nd of April document on transmission advice and guidance for care homes, in it, PHE explicitly state that policy is based on an assumption that transmission of COVID follows the same transmission mechanism as SARS because there is not yet enough reliable evidence to update that that assumption. So that is why what you think are two incompatible statements are both true. We were worried about the anecdotal evidence. I was worried about it from January. And there was some evidence of it, often caveated, often with unlikely, written by it. But policy was based on an assumption that COVID transmitted the same way as SARS, i.e. no asymptomatic transmission. That was a source of frustration to me, but I couldn't get PHE to change it because it was a clinical, scientific decision, and I was the Secretary of State. The frustration I had is that with hindsight, I should have simply said, that may be your scientific evidence and advice to me. However, we shall base policy on an assumption that there is asymptomatic transmission. There would have been downsides to that assumption, and there's reasons that we didn't do that. But essentially, my hunch, which was that there is, I should have used that to overrule the science. But you can understand why I did that on a couple of occasions, and we can go through those if you like. For instance, the returners from Wuhan, which are required to be quarantined, when the scientific advice was don't quarantine them. But that is what explains the apparent incompatibility with the statements that you set out, and that is both the evidence at the time and how I feel about it now.
In any event, it was obvious, wasn't it, from the lockdown in Italy, in the 11 municipalities to which you refer in your statement on the 21st of February,
Yeah.
and the data from the Diamond Princess outbreak, the cruise ship on which there were UK nationals, that there was actually very significant asymptomatic transmission. So would you agree that certainly by those dates, 22nd of February, the lockdown in Italy, and the Diamond Princess data of mid-February, that there was clear asymptomatic transmission?
No, I would say that with hindsight, that is now obvious. At the time, there was a fog of uncertainty over this question, as is clear in all of the documentation that you've cited.
Your department received reports showing from the Diamond Princess outbreak that around 18% of the people infected on board that boat, and it was a closed environment, you'll recall, had showed no symptoms. It was in the press, it's referred to in SAGE memoranda. It was obvious there was asymptomatic transmission.
So why couldn't I get PHE to change the scientific advice to base the assumption of transmission on asymptomatic transmission as opposed to symptomatic transmission? I hope you can understand how frustrating this was. The answer to that question, here I'm putting myself, because I was in the pro let's worry about asymptomatic transmission camp. The frustration was that understandably, from their point of view, and here I'm putting myself in their shoes, the PHE scientists said, we have not got concrete evidence. The WHO, 2nd of April, no documented asymptomatic transmission. So the international scientific consensus was that there is no documented asymptomatic transmission. Therefore, policy was based on the assumption that COVID transmitted as SARS. I had, by this stage, a significant amount of anecdotal evidence, and hence I've gone over this and over this and over this in my mind. If I had just said the science is different, that would not have carried the system with me, because I'm the representative of the people, if you like. I'm as the Secretary of State, and the scientific advice was very clear to the contrary. What I could have done was said, that may be the formal scientific advice. I am overruling it and saying instead we're going to assume asymptomatic transmission. That would have had risks on the other side of assuming spread where it may have been unlikely to happen. But with hindsight, of course, I wish I'd done that. Hence, it is my single biggest regret. But what I'm trying to do is
Mr. Hancock, it's perfectly understandable. You would wish to answer at length on this important issue, but could I invite you just please to stick to the question?
Sure.
229430, page 2, is a message between the government's chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer on the 24th of July, where Sir Patrick Vallon says, why the Prime Minister and Matt Hancock saying we didn't know about asymptomatic transmission? Chris
Exactly.
Whitty, I have no idea. We didn't know how important they were, that is correct, but we were aware of the possibility. But it is correct, we thought transmission was most likely after symptoms, like SARS. Not by March. I think we were pretty clear that we thought there was asymptomatic transmission. We'll have to put up with quite a bit of this, just as well the Sage minutes are public domain. And that's a reference, Mr. Hancock, to the material which I've summarised for you.
Yes. Do you know who unknown is?
Yeah, unknown, as I've said, is Sir Patrick Vallance.
Okay.
The first entry is Sir Patrick Vallance. So would you acknowledge that the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor are stating there that they did know and they told you and the Prime Minister about the significance of asymptomatic transmission and the degree of it, and they are confounded by the notion that you and the Prime Minister are now apparently saying you didn't know about it?
We're not apparently saying anything. We are clearly stating the position that was put to us as the scientific position, based on the global international scientific position, which was to base policy on an assumption of no asymptomatic transmission as set out by PHE. That is what is being referred to in the first of these messages. And I assume this is a shorthand from Patrick Vallance saying, why is PM and Matt Hancock saying we didn't know? What we were saying was the error was that the scientific advice required or formally advised that policy should be based on an assumption of no asymptomatic transmission. And the problem here in this exchange is demonstrated by the words pretty clear. We were pretty clear that we thought, right? If the government chief scientific advisor knew, as opposed to was pretty clear and thought, then that may have changed the UK scientific position. But he didn't know. As we've seen, there was huge uncertainty. I'm not blaming him at all for this. There was huge uncertainty on this question. And it is deeply frustrating to me now, and it was deeply frustrating to me at the time, that being pretty clear was not good enough to change the scientific advice I was receiving on which to base policy.
All right. In any event, your witness statement acknowledges that the importance of this debate is that if you don't know the extent of asymptomatic transmission, you can't get a handle on the extent of the virus and therefore what proportion of persons infected will die, because you don't know how many people at the base level have got the infection who don't die. And you make the suggestion in your witness statement that what could have been done in light of what you say is the lack of knowledge about the extent of asymptomatic transmission, is apply a precautionary approach.
Yes.
That is to say, simply state as a matter of internal policy or approach.
Yes.
We don't know the extent of asymptomatic transmission. We may not know for some time. So why don't we just apply a careful precautionary approach, which is assume that it is at a significant level. In fact, it turned out to be between 30 and 34%, but you could take any level, 20, 25, 30%, and then decide upon the countermeasures that are necessary to be able to meet that threat in terms of infection control. I apologise for the long preamble. the stage was reached, wasn't it, in early March, around about the 10th and the 11th, that regardless of the science on asymptomatic transmission, that was the correct approach. You simply had to plan on the basis that it was, regardless of how strong the science was. So did it matter, ultimately, given that you did apply a precautionary approach?
This question did matter. It is not fair to say that the scientists knew for sure about this by mid-March. It's just not. That's not how they. That's not how it was represented.
I've not asked you about that. I've asked you: does it matter that there was a debate, regardless of whether you were told or not, about the degree of asymptomatic transmission?
Yes.
If sensibly, the point was reached at which you just had to plan on the basis that there was, and decide what appropriate countermeasures could be promulgated and applied.
But that isn't what happened.
Well, Mr. Cummings' evidence is to this inquiry that by the 11th of March, it was generally understood that a large percentage was being transmitted asymptomatically. And in any event, the planning material, the reasonable worst-case scenario approach, presumed that there would be a high degree of asymptomatic transmission. So did it matter?
Well, that is not accurate, as much of that particular witness's evidence is not accurate. That is not accurate in all areas. And that's the problem. I took the precautionary principle, in some cases overruling the scientific advice on the precautionary side. I mentioned, for instance, when we brought people back from Wuhan in late January, early February, the scientific advice from PHE was that they did not need to be quarantined, and I overruled that and said that they needed to be quarantined based on the precautionary principle. And this is, but then until the CDC evidence on the 3rd of April, there were decisions taken based on the PHE assumption of no asymptomatic transmission. Now, not all. And in some, in the case of lockdown, the asymptomatic or non-asymptomatic route of transmission wasn't really discussed. It was clear that the cases were going up and we needed to take action. The route of transmission for that decision was a second-order consideration, but it was a primary consideration in some other areas, and on those, the official advice remained as it was until the 3rd of April.
Had you understood, and had it been widely understood, that there was significant asymptomatic transmission earlier, what measures might have been available and might have been considered to be applied? You expressed this as being your greatest single regret.
Yes.
What wasn't done on account of what you say was the information that you were not provided with? What practical countermeasures might have been available which were not appreciated because of this fallacy?
Well, for instance, in the guidance to care homes on discharge from hospital...
No, I've asked you about countermeasures in the context of infection control in March. I'm not talking about discharge from hospital. I'm talking about what policies in terms of preventing the spread of the infection around the United Kingdom, in response to which the government did, of course, impose measures on the 12th, the 16th, the 20th and 23rd of March ultimately. Yeah. What measures might have been applied differently had this misunderstanding, to use a neutral expression, not arisen?
I don't think it would have made a difference to those specific decisions. I think it made a difference in terms of how infection prevention and control was done within health and care settings.
That's very clear. How much time, if you like, doctrinally was given to this debate as the government machine trundled on in February and March?
Ironically, in this case, not enough. If the chief scientific advisor's view, as expressed later in July in that WhatsApp exchange with the chief medical officer, if there had been a successful engagement between his view then, as in we pretty much knew, and the PHE scientists who were making the recommendations for policy within health and care settings, If there'd been better engagement there, for instance, then the scientific advice might, I don't know, we can't be sure, might have been different. If, for instance, the evidence I've now seen, which I wasn't aware of at the time, amongst some of the most eminent scientists in the UK, like Professor Ferguson and Professor Edmonds and others, that they had a higher degree of confidence that there was asymptomatic transmission. If that had been successfully promulgated to the World Health Organization, then we may have had a difference in the advice coming from the WHO. So we needed actually more debate about this, not less.
Why was that crucial information, if, as you've described it, not promulgated to you? SAGE existed to provide the United Kingdom government with scientific advice. They were contributors to SAGE. They communicated regularly within and without SAGE with Professor Sir Chris Whitty, who, together with Sir Patrick Vallance, spoke to you and your officials on a daily basis.
Yes, and
why did you not know this?
I knew what they knew, and I read the SAGE minutes. And as you'll see, the SAGE minutes and the various other things that I did see at the time clearly state that there may be, or there is likely some, or there are all sorts of formulations of, in a fog of uncertainty, but it was all essentially unproven anecdote.
Can I pause you there, Mr. Hancock? You appeared to give the suggestion that the information that you were given was itself contained within a fog of uncertainty. I've put to you the NERVTAG meeting of the 21st of February stated the evidence suggests that 40% of virologically confirmed cases are asymptomatic. That's not much of a fog, is it?
I didn't see that evidence.
119469, paragraph 3.4, page 6. This was the reference to John Edmonds on NERVTAG. We looked at it about 10 minutes ago. Oh, you saying you didn't see it at the time?
NERVTAG, no.
Right.
I saw SAGE minutes, not NERVTAG minutes.
All right. There was another related issue, and you've referred to this in the context of the policy of discharging patients from hospital, and that's the testing for asymptomatic patients.
Just before we say,
yes.
to make sure, just to give one final point of evidence on this contradistinction between what some of the scientists were saying and the scientific advice on which some of the policy was based. On the 24th of March, so later than these times we were discussing, PHE describes anecdotal cases of asymptomatic transmission, but concludes these, and now I quote, do not provide evidence for asymptomatic transmission. So that is the evidence that's being provided to me as conclusive. So I'm saying anecdotage and unconfirmed data about this. Through this period, I'm constantly pushing, as I was from January, for conclusive science. And PHE's advice to me is these do not provide evidence for asymptomatic transmission. So that is why there's an apparent distinction here, and it is frustrating this wasn't cleared up earlier.
Is the nub of it that you appear to be suggesting now that you placed, understandably, it's a related agency, you placed greater weight upon what you were being told by PHE, perhaps formally, than the information which was being relayed both directly and indirectly, routed through NERVTAG, SAGE, the CMO and the GCSA to central government?
It's a very good question. Did I place greater weight on it? I'm not sure I saw it like that. I saw inconclusive evidence on the one hand and categoric conclusions based on the scientific method, i.e., this is unproven, on the other.
All right.
And those only finally got resolved at the very start of April with the CDC evidence.
On the 11th of March at a cabinet meeting, 56132, page 4, you said unless individuals were symptomatic, there was no point in being tested.
Yeah.
Test would not work. SAGE, and not NERVTAG, but SAGE, the official advisory body for scientific body for emergencies, which was the sole route of scientific advice for the government, had reported on the 28th of January, 61510, page 3, paragraph 8, specific tests should be ready by the end of the week with capacity to run 400 to 500 tests. Sensitivity of tests unclear, particularly in early phases of illness or when symptoms are mild. Currently, it would not be useful to test asymptomatic individuals as a negative test result could not be interpreted with certainty.
Yeah.
The point made by Sage, and it's apparent also from Sir Patrick Valence's diaries and from WhatsApps between the CMO and the GCSA, is that the scientific evidence was saying you can test for asymptomatic individuals. And of course, you knew very well that contact tracing for the first few hundred individuals for travellers and index cases requires testing of everybody, whether they're asymptomatic or not.
Yeah.
But that there were real problems with the certainty of the outcome.
Correct.
Because you couldn't be certain that the negative test result, if that's what it was accurate.
Yes.
But you told Cabinet
Yes.
there is no point in being tested. The test would not work.
Yes.
There is a difference there, Mr. Hancock.
Yes.
Why was there a difference?
Well, being told that the test would not work is the advice that I received from PHE from January. As it happened, I said a moment ago, I saw the SAGE minutes. I saw the SAGE minutes from some time into the crisis. I did not see the very early SAGE minutes.
Can I just pause you there? But you, of course, accept that the Chief Medical Officer's evidence, which is that anything that was important from SAGE was relayed to you at the multitude of meetings which...
Yes, but not in terms of linguistic analysis, and that is what this debate and discussion comes down to, and the misunderstanding that the government chief scientific advisor had which came to the fore in his evidence on this point. If I could just set out the position as I saw it. Apropos this SAGE conclusion, PHE stated clearly that the tests could not work to identify that people are negative. And that happened in early January, that advice. And the reason it was important at the time for policy reasons was about testing at the border. There was a debate about testing at the border. I said, why don't we test at the border? And PHE correctly said, if we test at the border, we will not find people because the tests are unlikely to be sensitive, as it says here, on people with who are asymptomatic. And so I described tests will not work in the context of testing people who don't have symptoms in order to prove that they are negative of coronavirus. Of course, if a test has any sensitivity at all, then it may find some people who are asymptomatic where contact tracing can be useful. In that context, tests can work, but they cannot be described as working for the purpose of ruling that somebody is negative of coronavirus.
All right. You accept that there was an important difference between, you described it as linguistic, but there is an important difference between being told that a test has concerns about the level of certainty and being told that a test, quote, to use your words, if the Cabinet minutes are right, does not work.
Yes, it does not work for what purpose? That's the key thing.
How could, on this vital issue, because as you recognise, testing of asymptomatic patients became hugely vital to the discharge of patients from hospital,
yes,
and to the spread of the virus around the care sector, adult care sector.
Yes.
How, on this hugely important issue, could that distinction, that difference of understanding, have resulted?
Well, let me explain.
Actually, don't worry, Mr. Hancock. I'm not sure this is a point worth pursuing, Mr. Keith. I think Mr. Hancock's given his explanation, which is he doesn't accept the meaning that he would attribute to his comments is the meaning.
I'll move on.
Thank you.
Now, we've been exploring, Mr. Hancock, some of the areas asymptomatic transmission, the testing, what was said about the DHSC and its response. Because, as you know very well, Mr. Cummings, Sir Patrick Vallance in his diaries, Helen McNamara have made reference to you lying, to you getting overexcited and just saying stuff, that you say things which surprise people because they knew the evidence base wasn't there. Out of fairness to you, and because this is a vital issue that goes to how well the system of government was operating, you being, as you describe in your book, in the hot seat, how could, to a significant extent, important government advisors and officials have concluded that the Secretary of State for Health, in the maw of this public health crisis, the maw of the beast, was a liar?
Well, I was not. You will note that there's no evidence from anybody who I worked with in the department or the health system who supported that, those false allegations. And indeed, where there have been specifics attached to any of those allegations, I've gone through them, and I'd be very happy to answer questions on any of them. And then in a couple of occasions, there were general sweeping allegations which had no evidence whatsoever. In one case, the witness said, "I haven't got this in black and white." Well, of course not, because it wasn't true. And in another case, the witness said the accountability and governance arrangements didn't pick this up. Well, they didn't because, again, the allegation wasn't true. What there was a great deal of hard work on our side and a toxic culture that we had to work with, which seemed to want to find people to blame rather than spend all of their effort solving the problems. And it's, you know, maybe, as I've said before, I drove the system hard. Sometimes the people I was trying to push into action didn't think the action was necessary. And that's already been very clear. I didn't know about most of this at the time. I knew that it was difficult getting stuff through the centre, but nobody expressed any of these things to my face.
Mr. Cummings was not one of the people who, against him, it might be said that he was resisting the government machine being moved onwards, because the evidence plainly shows that around about the 13th, 14th of March, it was one of the voices calling for more immediate action. But he says, in terms, not just that you lied, but that you were unfit for the job. And as you know, he and Mr. Johnson debated that claim, and there was a debate about you being sacked. The inquiry has no interest in the truth of the allegations. It is impossible for the inquiry to resolve them. But the fact that the Prime Minister, his chief advisor, the Deputy Cabinet Secretary, the Cabinet Secretary all questioned your candour and, in large part, fitness for the job is a vital issue to any examination of how well the system responded. This is an extraordinary state of affairs.
Well, the inquiry can, if it chooses, get to the bottom of each of the specific allegations because they are not true, and I'm very happy to write with an explanation of each and every one of them. Of course, the impact of the toxic culture that essentially was caused by the chief advisor, but that clearly I can now see, not that I knew at the time, others were brought into, that was unhelpful. On the other hand, in the heat of a crisis, people say things, especially on WhatsApp, which is essentially conversational, that they don't, that they may not be their full considered opinion. For instance, the Cabinet Secretary also described me as can do in a note to the Prime Minister. So, I think there's a broader view, and also I got on with him perfectly well through the whole thing, and afterwards, and it's only because of this inquiry that I've seen the language that he was using behind the scenes. So, was this a problem up to a point? What is the lesson for the future? I think, unfortunately, the lesson for the future is systems need to be in place so that if there is a malign actor in number 10...
Do you mean Mr. Cummings?
Well, in this case, that was the example, but there may be in the future. But if there are people whose behaviour is unprofessional, the system needs to be able to work despite that. That's why I think I place reliance on the COBRA system and why I tried to use the COBRA system. And I think that that is the repository of emergency response knowledge, understanding, experience within government, and it was the appropriate place to run this response until it became so big that it needed its own systems of decision making. And eventually the COVID-S and COVID-O system was put in place, which is what I'd recommend for the future in an all-engulfing crisis like this. So up to a point it was a problem. Was it unpleasant? Yes, it was unpleasant for a whole load of my staff as well, who was subject to this sort of abuse from the chief advisor. It went wider than I thought at the time, but my job was to lead the health and care system, the whole thing, 1.4 million people in the NHS, over 3 million in social care. And so I just got on with doing that to the best of my ability.
Mr. Hancock, can I interrupt? You said systems need to be in place, and then you spoke about COBRA and COVID-O, COVID-S,
yes,
that we know did come into place.
Yeah, to a degree.
Right, so what are you suggesting should happen in the future if you have, as you described it, a malign influence?
Well, whether or not you have a malign influence, unfortunately, the system needs to be there in case, irrespective of the personalities of the people who are involved. The way I would recommend it is that when you have a small or medium-sized crisis, the lead government department model works. When a crisis becomes clearly cross-governmental, then you need either the CDL, and the CDL really should be also the Deputy Prime Minister. That is the role. It's how it's normally done. It's how it's done at the moment. Occasionally, the Deputy Prime Minister is another Secretary of State. Far better if CDL. And so you can escalate to a CDL to have a cross-government response, and that would also bring in more senior resource from other departments. Then you can escalate the COBRA system to the Prime Minister, and then the escalation above that is to put in place specific structures, cabinet subcommittees, for response to an all-engulfing crisis. We tried with the MIG process. That was it helped, but it wasn't as good as the COVID-S, COVID-O structure, which I think is the best in class of all my decade in government in terms of how to run a national level response.
Thank you.
I need to ask you about 3 ancillary issues related to the issue of the atmosphere and the operations of number 10, Mr. Hancock. So we're not done with this subject yet, I'm afraid. Firstly, evidence has been given that Mr. Cummings may have exercised an unhealthy degree of influence on the Prime Minister. You may or may not be aware that it is contested evidence. Some witnesses, or one witness has said he did, another witness directly after said he didn't. Are you in a position to comment on that particular aspect? That is to say, whether or not a special advisor exercised too great an influence on the decision-making process. And I invite you, please, to stick to this rigid structural issue. In terms of the decision-making ability of the Prime Minister, was there too great an influence operated?
At times, yes.
Right.
And I'll be very specific about what I thought went wrong. As the COBRA system was running, in February, the Prime Minister's chief advisor decided that he didn't like the COBRA system. That is on the record. And he decided instead to take all of the major daily decisions into his office. And he invited a subset of the people who needed to be there to these meetings. He didn't invite any ministers. He didn't regard ministers as a valuable contribution to any decision-making, as far as I could see in the crisis, or indeed any other time.
So that's the COBRA.
he took the decisions, attempted to take them from the Cobra process to a meeting that he ran daily at 8 a.m. He invited some of the right people, but not all of them. He didn't check with me beforehand and clashed it directly with my daily meeting, which was frustrating because we had a daily meeting in the department to feed into the Prime Minister's meeting at 9:15. The reason these meetings are important is because there is a proper government emergency response system, and it was actively circumvented. And in one of these early meetings, the chief advisor said decisions don't need to go to the Prime Minister. Now, that is inappropriate in a democracy. And I saw it simply as essentially a power grab, but it definitely got in the way of organising the response for the period it was in operation. It was then replaced with the MIG system, which was better.
We'll come back to that later. So your position is it, and the inquiry asks you, because of course the inquiry asks Mr. Cummings to what extent the view taken by him and others of your unfitness for the job was a matter of atmospherics or toxicity, or whether or not it actually affected the running of the government machine and led to deleterious consequences. Do you assess that generally Mr. Cummings's role, by contrast, of itself had a significant impact on the smooth running or significant operation of the government machine?
Yes, of course.
Right. It may be thought to be rather remarkable, Mr. Hancock, that whilst you couldn't have been unaware of the damage, as you say, being done to the government machine by Mr. Cummings, and he and others, and I emphasise, you've referred to a malign influence, but it's not just Mr. Cummings who questioned your fitness for the job. How could, in the face of this unprecedented crisis, how could this position have been allowed to eventuate? If it was damaging the government's response to matters of life and death, it just couldn't have been allowed to continue, surely.
Yes, it was deeply, deeply frustrating. And on two levels, we've discussed the structural problem, which was essentially an advisor trying to take executive authority away from the Prime Minister for a period until the Cabinet Secretary stopped it and put in place the MIG process. But there was also effectively a cultural problem, which is that there was a culture of fear inculcated by the behaviour of this particular individual. He did, in the middle of this, in the middle of February, effectively cause the resignation of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Previously, just before... it's important. It's important because...
Mr. Hancock, please forgive me. The determination of what's important is really for the questioner. If my lady believes that you're answering, I'm preventing you from raising something that's important, she will no doubt correct me.
Yeah.
The issue of the resignation of the Chancellor of the Exchequer doesn't appear to me to be of great moment in the context of the coronavirus response.
It was. Let me explain why.
Well, if you wish to simply state...
Yeah, it was, in just two sentences.
Please, shortly.
It was because it inculcated a culture of fear, whereas what we needed was a culture where everybody was brought to the table and given their heads to do their level best in a once-in-a-generation crisis. The way to lead in a crisis like this is to give people the confidence to do what they think needs to happen, and it caused the opposite of that. May
her ladyship presume from that answer that you would say the same in relation to the way in which Mark Sedwell, the Cabinet Secretary, was treated in May of 2020?
Well, I wasn't involved in that, but it would be far better for the system to have been run in a positive, collaborative spirit as we tried to run the health family You know, that's not there were tensions within the health system. There were always trade-offs and challenges, but we essentially had a collaborative system where everybody came together and did their level best in a positive spirit. And when something went wrong, we asked how to fix it. And that is how it's the only way to lead very large organisations in a crisis.
Indeed. Now, Ms. Hancock, can we come please to the chronology and your understanding of the crisis faced by the government? Now we've put many of the structural and doctrinal pieces of this jigsaw into place. In your statement, you say that on the 9th of January, you received, because you'd asked for, a full written briefing on the news reports that you've seen in the press. You made inquiries about, at that very early stage, exercise sickness. You attempted to find out what the basic position was in relation to the vaccines. You spoke to the CMO repeatedly. I don't want to go into the detail of it, but you asked for and received a full written briefing on the 9th of January. But you also say in your statement that you spoke to the Prime Minister in the voting lobby and told him about the new disease. And you, in a later passage in your statement, say you called him directly on at least 4 occasions to try and impress upon him my concerns as to the potential impact from the virus. Do we take from that sentence in your statement that you had repeatedly tried to speak to him about it because you assessed that the seriousness of the position was not being made plain to him? He didn't get the seriousness of the position?
No, in his conversations with me, he always acknowledged the potential seriousness. And at that stage, his response was that I needed to keep an eye on it and do what I thought was necessary. And by the way, I think that was an entirely appropriate response at that very, very early stage. After all, we have these potential pandemic threats all the time. There've been 2 in the last fortnight in the newspapers.
Well, they're your words, and on at least 4 occasions during January, and so we deduce from that you didn't just mean in that first early week or 10 days. You meant throughout January.
No, I meant until around the middle of January. You know, the time. My view of this moved from being, one of many potential crises that are always on the radar of a health secretary to a full-scale national concern in the middle of January. And you'll know from the evidence that I think it was the 22nd of January from memory that Chris Wormold delegated all other responsibilities in the health department other than what was then known as the coronavirus. So we took it very seriously and made it an absolutely number 1 issue from the middle of January.
Right. Mr. Hancock, will you forgive me if I just remind you, please, to keep your answers as concise as you feel you can?
Okay.
In your statement, you nevertheless assert that others appear to be astonished or disinterested, or you were astonished that some people were disinterested or less than interested, as you saw it, in the seriousness of the position as you saw it. Is that a reference to people who mattered, that is to say, people who were in a position to be able to move the government machine forward, or were they just people you happened to speak to?
Everybody. Everybody. From, if you think about it like this.
Just please, Mr. Hancock, were they people who mattered at the senior levels of government, or were they people you spoke to in the course of your day-to-day duties?
Both.
All right. On the 13th of January, your statement describes how NervTag gave advice to the effect that there was, and I paraphrase, very little point in screening. And your statement demonstrates how throughout January, but particularly following Chinese New Year, you were concerned about the relatively limited way in which the government was responding to the risk of infection through the border, the references to handing out leaflets, asking passengers whether they were ill. And you say in broad terms that you sought, or at least wished to have debated, the issue of quarantine, travel ban, and that not enough in general terms was being done. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
The inquiry's had a great deal of evidence from the scientists as to the scientific and practical realities of border controls. Is it fair to say that, notwithstanding your concerns and your prodding of the border system, ultimately, relatively speaking, very little was done by way of stringent restrictions being placed on the border to stop infection control? Stop infection.
Yes.
Right.
And I accepted their advice. And then when in mid-February, the virus blew up first in Italy, that was proof point they were right, because Italy had put in place more screening at the border. And then they became the first place known to be widely infected in Europe. And that was confirmation, if you like, that the scientific advice had been right.
Your statement also makes plain that you sought assurances as to what was in place in terms of the contact tracing programme, such as it was.
Yes.
And you became aware, as perhaps you would have known already as the Secretary of State, that there was a limited process of test, trace, isolate, test, trace, contact and isolate for high consequence infectious diseases, for travellers, for the first few hundred of cases. That was the overall system.
Yes.
How soon did you appreciate that that system, limited as it was never going to be able to cope with the unprecedented demands of a pandemic with an infection fatality rate of 1%?
During February.
During February. All right. Sir Chris Whitty has described to the inquiry that he had no illusions that the United Kingdom was well set up to meet the challenges of a major pandemic, in part because of the absence of a sophisticated TTI system. He knew the investment in health, public health, for the purposes of dealing with the pandemic was suboptimal, to use his words. And he knew that there were, realistically, few levers of power at the disposal of the government to be able to control the spread of an infection, short of the measures which ultimately came to be applied. When did you begin to appreciate that that was the reality?
Again, during February. During January, there was very high quality science undertaken. The scientific performance of PHE was superb. And the advice I got was reassuring that we were well placed. And it gradually became clear to me that this wasn't right.
In your statement, you refer to how in late January, and in spite of your contact with the Prime Minister, your team was still getting calls from Number 10 and being dragged into meetings about how you were going to deliver manifesto commitments.
Yes.
What was that about?
Well, the Prime Minister had just won a thumping majority, and his team understandably wanted to make sure that the manifesto was delivered in full over 5 years so that they could successfully run for re-election.
Mr. Hancock, you raised this in your own witness statement in the context of raising your concerns with the Prime Minister and then noting that your team was being sidelined or being diverted from dealing with the crisis because of the manifesto meetings. They're your words, not the inquiries.
Yes.
Did that matter? May we presume from the fact you've mentioned it that it mattered?
Yes, it would have been far better if that time had all been spent on the gathering storm.
All right. On the 23rd of January, you'll recall that you gave a statement to Parliament. I refer to that because it is a matter of record and not by way of an implied or indirect breach of parliamentary privilege. Because on the same day, you say in your statement that the Chief Medical Officer told you that there was a 50-50 chance that the Wuhan quarantine would not work.
Yes.
Did you deduce from that that if the quarantine in Wuhan did not work, there was no practical means by which the further escape of the virus could be prevented?
Essentially, that is what I was told.
And that's why you were told by him also that there would be a global outbreak.
There was a 50-50 chance of a global outbreak, not a 100% chance. And that is also, I thought that it was a day earlier than the 23rd, but I'm not exactly sure of when he first said it to me. But this is also why I wanted a Cobra to try to wake up Whitehall to this threat.
You must have appreciated, Mr. Hancock, having been told by the chief medical officer that there was a 50-50 chance that the quarantine wouldn't work. And if it didn't work, the outbreak would be global, that the virus was coming.
Yeah.
That once the virus had spread beyond China,
Yes.
which of course it did at the end of January and the very beginning of February, indeed it had started by that stage already, but it wasn't sustained,
Yeah.
that the virus was coming,
Yes.
that there was no means of stopping it.
If we were in the wrong side of that 50-50, which it turned out that we were, yes, that's exactly why I tried to get the whole government system going. Yes.
So why did you and your department and the central government machine spend so much time in meetings in February, in March? There's a meeting on the 2nd of March. There's a meeting with the Prime Minister on the 8th of March. One with the Chancellor of the Exchequer on the 8th of March, debating the probability. And it was expressed in terms of 1 in 5, 1 in 10, 1 in 2 of the reasonable worst-case scenario eventuating. The reality was that once the virus had spread from China, it was game over. The virus would come. Why was so much time spent debating the relatively arid issue of what is the probability of the reasonable worst-case scenario coming to pass?
I don't recall being involved in that debate or wasting any time on it at all. On the contrary, in late January, I stated and concluded, I think, at Cobra, that the reasonable worst-case scenario should be the planning assumption for the country. I have since discovered, through the paperwork for this inquiry, that there was this wider debate about what were the chances of that. Now, there's two parts. First is it going to escape China? The second is, if it goes global, how bad will it be? Will we hit the reasonable worst-case scenario or something more central? I took the prior decision based on the precautionary principle at the start of this, I think it was on the 29th of January, that we should base our approach on the reasonable worst-case scenario happening. It took, as we've discussed earlier, it took time to get the rest of the system to believe that that was not an overreaction. As we've seen, that some people describing my position as mad. It was not mad. It was the correct precautionary principle at the time. And of course, with hindsight, it was right.
56226 is a Cobra meeting on the 29th of January, which you chaired. And just while we get to that point, can I just ask you to confirm what you referred to earlier, which is that you had, I think around the 22nd of January, called for a Cobra.
Yeah.
But Downing Street had put obstacles in your path. And I just want to establish that by way of the chronology.
That's a matter of fact.
I'm asking you.
I also requested that I make a statement to Parliament. That was also delayed because the Downing Street grid didn't include a pandemic.
All right. But there was, of course, a Cobra meeting on the 24th of January, the first one that you chaired, and then there was a second one on the 29th. And this is
yes.
At page 5, paragraph 3, there were two scenarios to be considered, said the CMO. The first was that the spread was confined within China. The second was that the spread was not limited to China and there would be a pandemic-like scenario with the UK impacted. So Chris Whitty has acknowledged in evidence, Mr. Hancock, that he was telling Cobra there that if the second scenario came to pass, which is that the spread is not limited to China, there would be a pandemic, and by necessary implication, it would hit
yes.
the world,
yes.
and the UK would be one of the countries.
Yes.
So what the inquiry wants to understand is, to what extent was it ever thought by you or others, well, if it does leave China, it doesn't really matter, or it may not matter absolutely, because there are practical measures which may mean that it won't come to the United Kingdom, and if it does, there is a means practically of stopping its spread.
That wasn't my view at all. On the contrary, this Cobra meeting happened the day after we'd had the reasonable worst-case scenario meeting in the department, which is the first time that I was really faced up to the fact that hundreds of thousands of people would die if there was a reasonable worst-case scenario, or could die. And that's when I I said, where are we up to on the vaccine? Can we accelerate the vaccine? Can we get testing going, etc.? So by this point, the Department for Health was fully engaged. The Permanent Secretary was fully spending all of his time, and I was spending as much of my time as I could on this in case the second scenario, as it's called here, happened, in case there was a pandemic.
If we then look at paragraph 4, the CMO said the reasonable worst-case scenario was similar to the reasonable worst-case scenario for pandemic influenza, that there was a 10% likelihood of the reasonable worst-case scenario happening, but this figure had not been agreed by SAGE. Can you explain to the inquiry why, if on the one hand the CMO is saying to you there's a 50-50 chance of it leaving, and if it does leave China, to paraphrase, game over.
Yeah.
But on the other, there is this debate about the likelihood of the reasonable worst-case scenario happening. Either it leaves or it doesn't.
No,
if it leaves, game over.
This figure, 10%, is a combination of two different considerations. One, 50-50, will it leave China? The second, if it goes global, are we going to be on the central case, a less bad case, or the reasonable worst case? So, for instance, in SARS, SARS did leave and go global, but the impact on the UK was nowhere near the reasonable worst case. In fact, it was quite close to the reasonable best case scenario.
Indeed. What, though, determined, on the premise that it did leave China and it was here, how bad it would be? The infection fatality rate was the infection fatality rate. The transmissibility was the transmissibility. What would determine whether or not it was a 200,000 death pandemic, a 300,000 or a 500,000 death? What did it depend on, Mr. Hancock?
Well, the central variables in that are the IFR, as you mentioned.
Which was determined undoubtedly by the middle and late, well, certainly by the
much later than
February.
This. Much later than this. So this is this is much earlier than we knew the IFR. We didn't know the transmissibility rate. And then, of course, the third factor, it would be the government and society's response, which can affect the R rate. So we didn't have the variables, but we did know that there was a significant chance of a pandemic. So it's 50% chance of a global pandemic. And then within that, there was a range of potential different outcomes from essentially it just petering out like SARS did in the West, all the way through to basically what happened, because what happened was essentially the reasonable worst-case scenario.
Why then, once the variables had become clear,
a month later, yeah.
Why then was the reasonable worst-case scenario still being debated, which it appears to be, in early March? The SAGE minutes, the 4th of March. There's a COBRA meeting on the 9th of March. The reasonable worst-case scenario debate appears to have rumbled on, long after it became clear that the virus was coming and attention needed to be paid to taking practical measures to stop it.
That's not my recollection. My recollection is at this COBRA meeting, if you go back down to the conclusions, we presume that the reasonable worst-case scenario should be we decide that the reasonable worst-case scenario should be the planning assumption of the United Kingdom. And from that moment, certainly in the department and the areas I led, that is the basis on which we operated. We assumed it would come, and we assumed that it would be terrible. And unfortunately, that assumption turned out to be correct. On the grounds that if it wasn't the reasonable worst-case scenario, that would be better. So prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And in the end, we prepared for the worst, and that's what happened.
So Chris Whitty has observed that having a reasonable worst-case scenario system is of itself somewhat ludicrous, because the reasonable worst-case scenario for a pandemic was predicated on it being unmitigated, and therefore, as he described it, wholly improbable. So attention was paid to whether or not a wholly improbable, at the very least unlikely scenario would ever happen. And then debate was then debate revolved around the probability of that wholly improbable event occurring.
Not in my recollection, and it certainly wasn't anything I put any effort or time into. So until you made that proposition, I didn't really know that there was a big debate about that, and I certainly wasn't involved in it. My view was reasonable worst case scenario is what we should plan for. Can we please all get on with it?
All right. 4th of February, there was what's been described in the inquiry as a stocktake meeting, 146558.
Yeah.
It's notable, Mr. Hancock, because the CMO briefed the Prime Minister on the Covid-19 that day for the first time. There's a reference to the Prime Minister meeting you, the CST and colleagues from the centre today, and the CMO had been there. And we can see from the second paragraph, there was a short update on coronavirus, but the majority of the letter is concerned with other DHSC and NHS matters. Given that this was the first time that the CMO had briefed the Prime Minister directly, and given the fact that the public health beasts in the jungle, yourself and the Prime Minister and others were there, do you feel that sufficient attention was paid to the debate on coronavirus, bearing in mind what you've told us about your concerns about the dawning crisis?
It would have been a far better use of time, with hindsight, to have concentrated entirely on the coronavirus crisis. When a meeting is prepared for the Prime Minister, especially in normal times, as this was seen as normal times, and of course this was before there were any deaths in the UK, then they would prepare a huge amount of work on a particular subject. To get something else even onto the agenda it requires some effort, and that's what we did.
All right. 6th of February, there was a cabinet meeting.
Yes.
Which you attended, 56137. We can see your name third down on the left-hand side. Page 6, there's a reference to a tabletop exercise.
Yeah.
Is that the exercise that became, we can see it 5 lines from the bottom, there would be a tabletop exercise the following week. Is that the exercise that came exercise Nimbus?
Correct.
Just dealing very briefly with Nimbus, evidence has been received by the inquiry to the effect that Nimbus focused on the likely impact on the NHS, and it's obvious because one of the terrible things that you faced in the course of that exercise was having to address the possibility of, in the face of a pandemic, making triage decisions about life and death. So obviously health and public health in the NHS was an important issue. Was that an exercise which you assessed was useful in terms of its attendees, or the learning that came out of it? It's an exercise that was specifically designed to deal with the coronavirus.
Yeah.
Did it work?
It worked only in one sense. So the Nimbus minutes demonstrate this, INQ 000195891. And the Nimbus minutes do show that the NHS asked the question of how to prioritise when there is insufficient NHS capacity. And there was a debate around that, as you can see in the minutes. And then I concluded that it should be for clinicians, not for ministers, to make a decision on this basis. And that's how we went on and proceeded. That is, the minutes are really clear on that. And that is also my clear recommendation, my clear recollection. But there was one really important lesson that came out of Nimbus, which was that there was no way we could allow the NHS to become overwhelmed. So the whole debate, for however long it was, an hour and a half, I can't remember the exact length of the exercise, was all about how do we manage once we're in the peak, when we have all these deaths. And my only memory, my only sort of conclusion from it was we must not let this happen. And of course, the question of who decides should there need to be a prioritisation is a horrific one. Thankfully, we never needed that. My view was that it should be clinicians, and that's in the minutes. But thankfully, as Sir Simon Stevens said, that situation never came to pass. Partly because, coming out of Nimbus, my view was, well, we can't ever let ourselves get that way.
You said it worked only in one sense. do we take it from that there were ways in which it didn't work? Were there opportunities lost there for learning, for perhaps the learning to be embedded into the machine?
Yeah. We should,
What were they?
If it had been based on the correct doctrine, which is that as soon as you know you're going to need to lock down, you lock down as early as possible, as we discussed in Module 1, then the exercise should have been, in my view, with hindsight, should have been, when we were faced with a decision, do we lock down or not, are we going to lock down the country? And at what point? How much data do you need? Because, of course, these are all times of enormous uncertainty. How much data do you need before you make a decision? What are the thresholds for deciding to lock down? When are we going to, what MPIs are we going to put in place, and in what order? How do you do this, save lives in the least damaging way? These are the questions we should have been addressing at Nimbus, not are we going to find enough mortuary space, and who should decide on the prioritisation of NHS treatment?
Just to unpick some of that, please, Mr. Hancock. So there was an obvious debate around an understanding of the likely impact on the NHS of this case scenario eventuating. Mm-hmm. There couldn't not have been, given the debate about body bags and the sheer numbers.
It was a sort of presumption at the start of the exercise.
Indeed. If the people who attended, ministers, officials and advisors, had no illusion but that a coronavirus pandemic, and we've debated, of course, the understanding as to when you realised the game was over and it was coming and there was no effective way of stopping it. Having appreciated that these were the sorts of deaths that were going to eventuate,
Yes.
why was there not consideration given, not just to the doctrinal point that you raise, which is what do we do about lockdowns, and if we have a lockdown, should we go early? Why was there not, in a more general sense, any debate or thinking about infection control countermeasures, home isolation, household isolation, shutting schools, all the other measures which in due course were imposed? That debate is absent. Why do you think that was?
Because the Nimbus exercise was put together on the basis of the 2011 pandemic flu strategy, which was based on the wrong doctrine that the government's job in a pandemic is to manage the consequences of a pandemic, not to stop it happening. And that is an absolutely fundamental learning that we must, as a country, embrace. If there's one thing that this inquiry learns, and I think it's very good that the inquiry is proposing to do a report after modules 1 and 2, because this central question of when do you lock down, what are the triggers, in what order should NPIs be brought in, how much data do you need? Because, of course, this is all done in a time of growing data. If you wait, you get more data. And so you can make decisions with more confidence. What are the legal structures? What are the operational structures that we should have ready in peacetime so that we can then bring them up to speed quickly? For instance, having a testing system ready to go, having a vaccine contract ready, having the domestic vaccine manufacture, which in my view is critical national infrastructure, and we should not rely on that happening abroad. All of these questions are central in my view, to the inquiry, but they're also should have been at the centre of Nimbus. But I'm not criticising the people who put Nimbus together. They were putting together an exercise that was based on the then plan, the 2011 pandemic flu plan. And at this point, it was still 50-50 whether it would escape China.
Your point about learning lessons for the future and it needs no emphasis. Coming back to whether or not something went wrong functionally with the outcome of that exercise. This was an exercise which wisely was put into place to deal with a coronavirus pandemic, to deal with examination of the practical measures that might be required. In the teeth of a pathogenic outbreak, which was already taking place, and it was a coronavirus outbreak.
Yep.
it was a ministerial and advisory tabletop exercise designed to try to address the very problem faced by the United Kingdom. And it fundamentally, there was a complete absence of any attempt to identify what sort of measures might be required and what the terrible thinking would have to be about whether they are implied.
Yeah, the question simply wasn't asked.
Right.
Is that a...
Yes, my lady.
I shall return at 1:45.